Dark Souls and Stalker: Shadow of Chernobyl are two of my favorite games of all time, and they both share a similar and insightful narrative device: an immoral power structure operating covertly to manipulate the player towards its own goals. Needless to say, spoiler warnings do apply because I'll be talking about the endings of both of these games. In both games, you're presented with a simple and clear goal from the outset. In Stalker, Strelok, the character you play as, is directed by Sidorovich, the first person you meet, to reach the center of the zone in search of riches.
They say he's found a path to the northern reaches of the zone. That is a virgin area, a real gold mine for artifacts.
And later, Strelok's mission is clarified that he needs to reach the center of the zone to access the Wish Granter and presumably have a wish granted. In Dark Souls, in the early sections of the game, you as the Chosen Undead are directed by at least 3 different characters to help save the Age of Fire, which is presented as being equivalent to saving the world.
Thou who art undead art chosen, in thine exodus from the undead asylum, maketh pilgrimage to the land of ancient lords.
Well, since you're here, let me help you out. There are, actually, 2 bells of awakening.
Chosen Undead, your fate is to succeed the great Lord Wynn.
But behind each of these goals are a lot of complexities and conflicting motivations. Games that subvert your initial expectations and suddenly reveal that the person or group that's been directing you the whole time have been secretly evil aren't uncommon, but neither of these games does that. Instead, your initial goal appears correct and morally sound for basically the entire game, if you never take the extra time to look around. What this means is that for most people playing these games, they're going to get one particular ending and feel like they've done everything right. And with the information available to them at the time, they have no immediately obvious reason to doubt that idea. In both cases though, the actual end result is not what you'd expect. The Wish Granter only grants wishes in the B-movie Wishmaster sense, meaning that it twists your wishes to destroy you.
I want to be rich.
In Dark Souls, continuing the Age of Fire requires the Chosen Undead to immolate themselves. The player sees Gwyn right before doing this, so we know that the end result of this action is that they become a toasted, mindless husk. The promised reward turns out to be self-destruction. And if you're an inquisitive person, these endings make you ask the question, what just happened, and why? Well, as it turns out, this self-destruction was planned from the very beginning by powerful forces within these games' respective worlds. In Dark Souls, Gwyn, the god king of the land of Lordran and his cronies, have helped to create a virtual assembly line for powerful heroes that will sacrifice themselves to continue the Age of Fire. In Stalker, the Wish Granter was created by the Sea Consciousness, a collective psychic entity made up of Soviet scientists operating out of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The Wish Granter is their bait to draw stalkers into the center of the zone, where they will become ensnared in their psychic traps, forcing them to become part of their zombie army of monolith soldiers.
When a stalker attempts to reach the zone center in order to fulfill some wish, we acquire control over his consciousness and program him to a specific mission. That is why we recruited stalkers by promising them the fulfillment of their most coveted desires. Once recruited, they would be sent to protect the zone's secret.
And in many other games, this information would have been presented to you from the very beginning, since it provides a perfectly compelling narrative with a built-in villain as is. But that's not how the story is presented here. Instead, this power structure was intentionally hidden. And that's not interesting just from a narrative perspective, because the way that these power structures camouflage themselves and the way that they control their participants mirror a lot of real-world structures. One of the methods of camouflage that these systems use is to hide within the guise of being natural. In Stalker, the sea consciousness used the environment of the zone as cover for their reality-bending experiments. And to outsiders, it would appear that the Chernobyl accident was the cause of the current bizarre and hostile state of the zone. The cycle of fire and dark, as we can see from the opening cinematic of Dark Souls, is the result of the bearers of the four Lord Souls using that power. Though it is stated explicitly in this opening cutscene that this is a constructed situation, all of the characters in-game treat this as just a foundational myth, an explanation for their current situation, the same way that ancient Greeks might explain bad weather as the will of the gods. And by the narrative referring to these beings as gods, they are treating this situation as a natural state. In reality, though, this is a situation that was constructed by conscious actors for their own benefit, and passed off to everyone else as simply the natural state of things. And by being camouflaged in the guise of nature, the creators of these structures prevent the realization that they are in fact the root cause of the problems of the zone and Lordran. Sure, no matter what, the zone would be radioactive, but if it weren't for the sea consciousness, there would be no mutants, no anomalies, and no monolith. Lordran is only full of zombies and demons because of attempts at extending the Age of Fire by Gwyn and the other lords. Both the situation in the zone and the situation in Lordran are not some natural aberration from a normal state that has just happened to fall out of balance. The zone is in the state that it's in because the sea consciousness is defending itself so it can continue its experiments. Lordran is in the state that it's in because of Gwyn and the other lords trying to retain their power by rekindling the flame. These situations are not these systems failing. They're them working the way that the ruling class expects them to work. And since the system is actually working as expected, that makes the Chosen Undead and Strelok's roles in this whole operation very clear. The system has set them out towards a goal, and told them that that goal will either save the world or provide some profound reward. The given path is an invitation from the system to trust the process. But there's a lot of evidence to indicate that the system in power here should not be trusted. The sea consciousness, even after many years, has failed to make any of their initial goals into reality. Instead, they've killed a ton of stalkers and turned the rest into brainless zombies, and they've made the zone even less habitable than it already was. Lordran under Gwyn was ruled by palace intrigue and a disdain for human life to the benefit of the literal ruling god class. The social stratification of humanity versus the god class is obvious as you travel from the slums of Blighttown up to the god's home in Anor Londo. With these facts in mind, it becomes obvious that the goal assigned to Strelok and the Chosen Undead only truly benefits the powerful ruling class if achieved. And we know from the texts that this powerful ruling class doesn't really have everyone's best interest in mind. The myth of Gwyn is that he sacrificed himself in order to help the world continue in the Age of Fire. But this is directly contradicted by the Serpent Cath.
The flames did fade, and only dark remained. Thus began the Age of Men, the Age of Dark. However, Lord Gwyn trembled at the dark, clinging to his Age of Fire and in dire fear of humans, and the Dark Lord who would one day be born amongst them. Lord Gwyn resisted the course of nature by sacrificing himself to link the fire and commanding his children to shepherd the humans. Gwyn has blurred your past to prevent the birth of the Dark Lord.
Gwyn was willing to sacrifice himself, but not out of selfless care for the world. Instead, it was out of a desire to safeguard his legacy and the safety of his family within their seats of power. The scientists of the sea consciousness were similarly willing to become part of a new being that they hoped could save the world through direct manipulation of people's minds.
Our main goal was to make small adjustments to the noosphere, allowing us to remove things like anger, cruelty, greed, and other negative factors from the planet.
But when their experiment failed, they couldn't give up the dream, and instead continued their work for about 20 years, with more and more dangerous results across the zone. Then to defend themselves, they took more and more drastic measures, like destroying mines with the Brain Scorcher, diverting people to their deaths with the Wish Granter, creating a mind-controlled army in the Monolith, and deadly emissions of energy that warp the zone further. The conflicts in Dark Souls and Stalker are brought about by untamed egos and their desire to see their goals achieved, no matter the cost. To reach those goals, the power structure manipulates its participants by spreading the myths and narratives that prop it up, and it starts doing that as early as it can. From the very beginning in Dark Souls, the characters around you understand and reinforce your position in the world.
I have failed in my mission, but perhaps you can keep the torch lit. There is an old saying in my family, "Thou who art undead art chosen. When thou ringest the bell of awakening, the fate of the undead thou shalt know."
Through this shared understanding of your role, these interactions help to keep you on the path that the power structure wants you to follow. Similarly, Strelok is pushed further and further into the zone by the stalkers around him talking about the Wish Granter. And sure, it's not at all uncommon for stories to guide their protagonists with myths. It's often integrated into the classic hero's journey. But in this case, the myth is entirely operating at the behest of the power structure in place, perpetuated by a series of useful idiots who were all indoctrinated by these same myths. And we can easily see that this myth doesn't lead Strelok or the Chosen Undead to do anything constructive. Instead, in search of their promised reward, they are both willing to kill a lot of people. Including this incredibly innocent and good dog. Even if you realize that the power structure is there, and that what it's doing is wrong, it still has a chance to change your mind. If you avoid the trick of the Wish Granter and face the sea consciousness, it explains its history and its goals to you.
We are the result of an experiment aimed at creating a super consciousness called sea consciousness. The zone is growing. We are trying to restrain its expansion, but humanity seems to be intent on hindering our work.
It then asks you to join it, and help it continue its work towards psychically manipulating humanity to behave better. If Strelok accepts this, he becomes part of the sea consciousness. This is a compromise based on ego. The idea that your participation within the system will somehow cause it to succeed where it has thus far failed, and failed pretty spectacularly at that. To compromise here is to say the evil that this system has caused can be justified if it is eventually successful at its ultimate goal. It is precisely the same reasoning that the sea consciousness used to justify continuing its work at any cost. This decision is naive at best, and it keeps the power structure that I've described trucking right along, with just another person at the helm believing that the ends justify the means, and that despite there being no structural change, it'll be different this time, because I'm in power now. The other endings to both games result in you escaping and destroying the system of power that's in place. In Stalker, if you choose not to accept the offer to join the sea consciousness, you're forced to fight through a series of obstacles, and then Strelok guns down the scientists in the sea consciousness pods. Next, Strelok is seen in a field, the zone seemingly gone. In this ending, the system that brought Strelok into the zone has been destroyed, freeing him and the other stalkers from the danger of the zone, but otherwise giving him no tangible reward, and his wish ungranted. In Dark Souls, walking away from the first flame begins the Age of Dark, which is also the age of humanity. The Chosen Undead is rewarded with power outside of the system that brought them there, and where that leads is unclear. Both of these possible endings are ambiguous. Strelok directly says he isn't sure if he did the right thing.
I don't know whether I was right or wrong. I guess I'll never know.
And I've seen a lot of people argue that the Age of Dark could result in humanity turning into monsters like what happened in Ulasil. But the one thing that we can say for certain is that the destruction of those power structures was the destruction of an immoral system which had indisputably caused great harm to the world that it existed in. Today in the real world, we see a lot of people defending the power structures around them because they're afraid of the uncertainty of the alternatives. We are, however, rapidly approaching a point where fear of alternatives to the known systems is becoming more and more costly. To pick an easy one, let's look at global capitalism and the dominance of fossil fuels. People are scared about the cost or limitations of alternative economic and energy systems, but the current ones are indisputably hurtling us towards an uninhabitable planet. Despite this, many people insist that we have to operate within the systems that brought us to this point in order to reach a solution. The argument for this, I guess, is that since we're familiar with these systems, we should hopefully be able to operate effectively within them and know what to expect, even if the outcomes aren't necessarily ideal. But the problem with this is that we usually don't actually have all the information. Folks generally trust that the way they've been told the system works is the way that it actually works, but deeper analysis shows that this is plainly untrue. Instead, the powerful people that have benefited from these systems have been intentionally withholding relevant information and lying about how things are going. These kinds of prevailing narratives don't just exert control over our governments and economies, they also try to control our lives as individuals. From the moment, and sometimes before we're born, we're implicitly and explicitly told a lot of things about the way things are gonna go. In video game terms, it's kind of like a dying knight tells you at the beginning of the game,
You are a boy? Well, this is what you must know. Only kiss girls. You must reproduce to be happy. And capitalism is good.
When the blueprint for a satisfying life doesn't work the way that we're told that it's supposed to, we're told that it's because there's something wrong with us, not with our culture. It's only due to decades of passionate struggle that the default lifestyle of heterosexual marriage and procreation, which, let me tell you, does not work for everyone, is finally beginning to be considered just one of many possible paths. But when LGBT folks in the past pointed out that the system doesn't work for them, they were told it was their fault, that they were mentally ill or doing something wrong. In these games, as in the real world, the ruling class furthers their agenda and controls the prevailing narrative with these techniques. Hiding your power structure as just being the natural order, pretending that systemic problems are an aberration from the intended status quo, indoctrinating folks as early as possible with system-supporting rhetoric, and justifying the consequences of the system with the excuse of good intentions. And for most, these systems have the same ultimate result: self-destruction and self-sacrifice that unjustly benefits the powerful. The thought of change is daunting. The power structures in our world intentionally present themselves as immovable and unchangeable, and to turn away from them requires accepting uncertainty. But to quote Andrei Tarkovsky's 1979 film Stalker, which inspired the game, "When a person is just born, they are weak and flexible. When they die, they are hard and insensitive. When a tree is growing, it's tender and pliant. But when it's dry and hard, it dies. Hardness and strength are death's companions. Pliancy and weakness are expressions of the freshness of being, because what is hardened will never win."
Get out of here, Stalker.